Hello, dear viewers. Before we dive into the dark depths of these horror stories, I have an important warning for you. What you are about to hear may give you goosebumps, scares and sleepless nights. These narratives were created to test the limits of fear and are not recommended for the faint of heart. So if you're easily scared, you might want to turn on all the lights and get a brave friend to watch with you. But if you're ready to face your fears, I'll need your help to make this experience even more terrifying. It's simple. Let us know in the comments where you're watching. Who knows, maybe terror is closer than you think. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any chilling stories. Leave a like to feed the dark forces that bring these stories to life. Remember, every like, subscription and comment strengthens our connection with the world of horror. Are you ready to get started? So turn off the lights, turn up the volume and prepare for a journey into the darkest corners of the human imagination. Good luck, you'll need it. The Demon of White Oak Mountain. Dense fog covered the slopes of White Oak Mountain like a ghostly shroud as Sarah Mitchell parked her Jeep Cherokee at the entrance to the state park. The digital clock read 3:47 p.m., and the October sun was already beginning its lazy descent behind the Tennessee mountains. As an investigative journalist for the Memphis Herald, Sarah had spent the last 6 months researching the mysterious disappearances that had plagued the region since 1973. "Are you sure about this?" asked Marcus Chen, his photographer and best friend, nervously adjusting the strap of his professional camera. Marcus had always been the skeptic of the group, but even he couldn't hide his discomfort at the dark atmosphere emanating from the forest. "I've never been so sure," Sarah replied, checking her backpack one last time. 17 people have disappeared here in the last 50 years. All under the same circumstances, all during the first week of October. From the back seat, David Cooper, a local history professor specializing in American folklore, cleared his throat. 19, actually, he corrected, his blue eyes shining with a mixture of fascination and apprehension. "I found 2 more cases in the State Library archives last night." The 4th member of the group, Rachel Thompson, a medium Sarah had initially been reluctant to include on the expedition, remained strangely silent. His tanned fingers were clutching a black crystal pendant, and his dilated pupils were fixed on an indefinite point between the trees. "There's something wrong here," Rachel finally murmured, her voice shaking slightly. "Something very old, and very hungry." Sarah ignored the shiver that ran up her spine. After years of investigating paranormal cases for his newspaper column, he had learned to trust his instinct, and his instinct was screaming that there was something different about this case. The disappearances followed a very specific pattern, always during twilight, always people alone, and always without a trace. The group began walking along the main trail, Marcus methodically photographing each landmark and fork. David consulted an old map, comparing it with notes in his leather notebook. The air grew heavier with each step, filled with a sweet, putrid odor that none of them could identify. After about an hour of walking, they arrived at a clearing that was not on any official maps. In the center, an altar-like stone structure stood, covered in symbols that David immediately began photographing and documenting. "This isn't Cherokee," he murmured, running his fingers over the inscriptions. "In fact, it doesn't look like anything I've ever seen before." Rachel staggered suddenly, leaning against a nearby tree for support. His face had lost all color, and his eyes were wide with terror. "They're still here," he whispered. "All of them. Arrested." Before anyone could question the meaning of those words, a distant howl echoed across the mountain. It wasn't a wolf, nor any animal they knew. The sound seemed to come from all directions at once, reverberating through his bones. The sun had completely disappeared now, plunging the forest into deep shadow. Sarah turned on her flashlight, but the light seemed to be swallowed by the unnatural darkness that surrounded them. The air was suddenly freezing, and their breaths formed little clouds of steam. "We need to set up camp," Sarah decided, trying to keep her voice steady. "Now." As they set up their tents with shaking hands, neither of them mentioned the shadows that seemed to move in the periphery of their vision, or the whispers the wind carried, whispers that sounded eerily like their own names. Night fell like a heavy curtain over the clearing. The two tents, set up next to the stone altar, looked too fragile against the darkness that surrounded them. Sarah and Rachel occupied one of them, while Marcus and David settled in the other. Nobody could sleep. "The symbols are pre-Columbian," David murmured, leafing through his notebook by flashlight. "But there's something different about them. Like they've been corrupted." A digital recorder captured the nighttime environment, Sarah's idea to document possible sound anomalies. The wind whispered through the trees, bringing with it fragments of sounds that made their hearts race: distant laughter, shuffling footsteps, the occasional muffled scream. Around 3 in the morning, Rachel sat up abruptly in her sleeping bag. "They're coming," he whispered, his glassy eyes fixed on the tent entrance. At the same moment, the temperature plummeted. The air inside the shacks condensed into a dense fog, and a strong smell of sulfur permeated the room. Marcus, who was near the entrance to his tent, was the first to see it: bluish lights, like will-o'-the-wisps, dancing between the trees. "Sarah," he called, his voice shaking. "You need to see this." But Sarah was already outside her tent, camera in hand. The lights multiplied, forming a circle around the camp. David began reciting something in Latin, a prayer, perhaps, as he frantically consulted his notes. It was then that they saw the first apparition. A translucent figure emerged from the forest, a young woman in 70s clothing, her face contorted into an expression of absolute terror. Behind her, more shapes began to materialize: men, women, some in modern clothes, others in costumes from bygone eras. Everyone shared the same look of horror. "It's them," Rachel whispered, grabbing Sarah's arm hard enough to leave bruises. "The people who disappeared. Their souls are trapped here." The stone altar began to vibrate, emitting a low hum that made his teeth hurt. The carved symbols glowed with a sickly red light, pulsing like a grotesque heart. "We need to get out of here," Marcus shouted, but his feet felt glued to the ground. An invisible force kept them immobile, while the apparitions got closer and closer. David, still holding his notebook tightly, began translating the symbols out loud: portal, prison, sacrifice, eternal hunger. A new sound cut through the night, something between a roar and a wail, so deep it made the very air tremble. The trees bent as if struck by a gale, and the darkness between them seemed to gain substance, condensing into a form that his eyes refused to fully process. Sarah managed to raise her camera just in time to capture the moment a mass of shadows, larger than any natural creature, emerged from the forest. His eyes were empty except for a red glow that seemed to suck in the light itself. "It's him," Rachel cried, her body shaking violently. "The gate guardian. The one keeping them trapped here." The creature towered over them, its form constantly changing like black smoke. The apparitions of the missing writhed in his presence, their expressions of terror intensifying. Sarah realized, with dawning horror, that the altar wasn't just an ancient structure, it was the key to something much darker. And they had just awakened their guardian. The shadow creature advanced, each movement distorting the space around it like an inkblot in water. Sarah felt something cold pierce her chest as one end of the dark mass passed through her, a feeling of despair so deep that her legs felt weak. "Don't look directly at her," David shouted, his voice breaking. "The symbols talk about an imprisonment ritual. The creature feeds on fear, on the vital essence of its victims." Marcus fired off his camera's flash frantically, each flash momentarily scattering the shadows, revealing fragments of a form that defied sanity, limbs that were too elongated, multiple faces, eyes that looked like windows into an abyss. Rachel fell to her knees, her black crystal pendant vibrating violently. "They're trying to warn us," he murmured, his words punctuated by sobs. "Souls, they weren't the first. It started long before, centuries before." Sarah managed to reach into her backpack, pulling out an old diary she had found in the newspaper archives, a settler's record from the 1800s that mentioned native rituals on the mountain. His hands shook as he leafed through the yellowed pages. "David," she called. "The natives never built this altar. They avoided it. This place is older than them." A piercing scream rent the air. Marcus had been dragged towards the altar by an invisible force. His body floated inches from the ground as the mass of shadows condensed around him. "No!" Sarah charged forward, but was repelled by an invisible barrier. Apparitions of the missing began to swirl around the altar, their faces now contorted into expressions of morbid ecstasy. David tore a page from his notebook and began reciting something in an ancient language, his voice taking on an otherworldly resonance. The symbols on the altar pulsed more intensely, and for a moment, Marcus was able to free himself. "The portal!" Rachel suddenly shouted, her eyes completely white. "It's not just a portal, it's a prison. The creature is trapped here, needs souls to maintain the seal." The revelation hit Sarah like a bolt of lightning. The pieces began to fall into place, the periodic disappearances, always at the same time of year, the old altar, the symbols of imprisonment. The natives were guardians, she whispered, finally understanding. They kept the creature trapped through voluntary sacrifices. When they were expelled from their lands. "The seal has begun to weaken," David added, his face pale with realization. "The creature has started hunting on its own, but it needs volunteer souls to maintain its prison. That's why it attracts people here, that's why it attracted us." The mass of shadows seemed to grow with each word, their shape now filling the entire clearing. The surrounding trees began to wither, their leaves falling like black rain. "There has to be a way to strengthen the seal without sacrifices," Sarah shouted, desperately leafing through the colonizer's diary. But before they could do anything, a metallic sound echoed across the clearing. Rachel's pendant had snapped in half, releasing an intense light that for a moment turned night into day. The light from the broken crystal revealed something none of them were prepared to see. For a split second, they saw the creature's true form, a writhing mass of intertwined bodies, faces in agony eternally fused together, limbs distorted into impossible patterns, a living tapestry of tortured souls. Rachel staggered back, blood pouring from her nose. The crystal was a protective artifact. The natives left several of them scattered around the mountain. The creature roared, a sound that made the stars themselves seem to tremble. The altar began to crack, bright red lines appearing on its surface like exposed veins. "The seal is breaking," David shouted, his notes flying around him in an unearthly whirlwind. "If she breaks free completely." Sarah didn't need to hear the rest. If that thing escaped its ancient prison, it wouldn't just be the mountain that would be in danger. His hands found something at the bottom of his backpack, a small leather bundle that a Cherokee elder had given him days before. "There is a way," Rachel said, her voice different, older. "The original seal was created with a sacrifice of love, not fear. That is why the creature can only be contained by souls who come willingly." Marcus, still fighting the invisible force, managed to reach his camera. "The photos," he gasped. "Sarah, the photos we took, the symbols have a pattern." David quickly gathered up his scattered notes, his eyes wide with realization. "It's a transmutation circle. Not just prison, but transformation. The ancients didn't just want to trap the creature. They wanted to purify her," Sarah added, unwrapping the package. Inside was a crystal similar to Rachel's, but it had an amber color and pulsed with its own light. The creature seemed to sense the presence of the crystal. The shadows momentarily retracted, and the spirits of the missing began to stir differently, as if responding to a new force. "Sarah, no!" Rachel screamed, realizing what her friend intended to do. "If you use the crystal like this, you will." "I know," Sarah replied, a sad smile on her lips. "But it's the only way. You need to complete the ritual, outside." Before anyone could stop her, Sarah ran towards the altar, the crystal raised above her head. The creature lunged towards him, but it was too late. The crystal touched the cracked surface of the altar just as the first light of dawn touched the clearing. What happened next would forever be etched in the memories of the survivors. An explosion of golden light, the sound of thousands of voices singing in unison, and Sarah Mitchell, journalist, friend, heroine, being enveloped in a cocoon of pure energy. The cocoon of light that enveloped Sarah pulsed like a cosmic heart, each beat reverberating through reality. The shadow creature howled, no longer in triumph, but in agony. The spirits of the missing began to glow, their expressions of terror being replaced by a transcendental serenity. The ritual. David shouted over the roar of the unearthly wind. We need to complete it now. Marcus and Rachel positioned themselves in specific spots around the altar, following David's frantic instructions. The local history teacher recited ancient words, his voice mixing with the ethereal chanting that seemed to come from all directions. Inside the cocoon of light, they were able to see Sarah one last time. She smiled, at peace with her choice. His body began to dissolve into golden particles, each of which penetrated the cracks in the altar. The shadow creature tried to resist, but was pulled inexorably towards the stone structure. The voluntary sacrifice, Rachel whispered, tears streaming down her face. She is transforming fear into love, purifying the trapped souls. The shadows began to fragment, revealing the souls that had been consumed over the centuries. One by one, they broke free from the dark mass, their forms restored, free from the terror that had imprisoned them for so long. The rising sun bathed the clearing in golden light, and the altar began to transform. The ancient inscriptions now glowed with a soft, comforting light. Where there were once symbols of imprisonment and fear, new patterns emerged, symbols of protection and renewal. The last thing they saw before the light became blinding was the creature's form dissolving completely, no longer a mass of horror and darkness, but a cascade of lights that rose toward the sky like aurora borealis. When they were finally able to open their eyes, the altar had transformed into a crystalline structure, translucent like pure quartz. In the center, floating in a column of soft light, was the amber crystal, now fused with Rachel's broken pendant. "It's over," David murmured, falling to his knees. "The cycle of terror has been broken." Marcus lowered his camera, realizing he had unconsciously documented everything. The photos would later reveal not horror and darkness, but a transformation of transcendental beauty. Rachel approached the transformed altar, her fingers gently touching the crystalline surface. "She didn't die," he said with certainty in his voice. "Sarah has become part of the protection. The mountain now has a new guardian." In the years that followed, White Oak Mountain changed. People still reported strange experiences in the region, but no longer of terror or despair. Visitors spoke of a feeling of deep peace, healing and renewal. Some swore they saw, on full moon nights, a female figure walking among the trees, her gentle smile illuminating the darkness. The Memphis Herald published one last story about the disappearances, credited posthumously to Sarah Mitchell. The article did not mention the full truth of what happened that night, but it ended with a sentence that captured its essence. Sometimes it only takes one act of true love to turn centuries of darkness into light. Marcus, David and Rachel kept in touch over the years, bonded by the experience they had shared. Once a year, in the first week of October, they returned to the clearing. Not to remember the horror they faced, but to honor the sacrifice that transformed a place of terror into a sanctuary of hope. And on the quietest nights, when the wind whispers through the trees of White Oak Mountain, some say they can hear a familiar voice, no longer in agony, but at peace, singing an ancient song of protection and eternal love. The whisper in the dark. Rain lashed the windows of the Dodge Durango as Emily Parker drove the winding road through the Adirondack Mountains. The GPS had lost signal 20 minutes ago, but she knew the old Blackwood mansion must be nearby. As an independent paranormal investigator, Emily had researched the site extensively before convincing her 3 friends to accompany her on this expedition. "I still can't believe I agreed to this," Mike Torres grumbled, adjusting his camera equipment in the passenger seat. As a professional documentary filmmaker, he had covered disturbing events before, but something about this case made him particularly uneasy. In the back seat, Dr. Laura Chen consulted her notes by the light of a flashlight. The forensic psychiatrist had become interested in the Blackwood case after discovering similar patterns of behavior between the mansion's former residents and its most disturbed patients. Beside him, James J. Washington stood silently, his fingers drumming nervously on his violin case. The classical musician had his own reasons for being there. His grandmother had been a servant at the mansion in the 1950s, and had mysteriously disappeared after a particularly stormy night. There, Emily pointed to an entrance almost hidden by vegetation. A wrought iron gate, corroded by time, displayed the Blackwood family crest, a raven holding a key in its beak. As the car stopped in front of the gate, the headlight briefly illuminated a faded sign, "Private property, no entry." Below, someone had written in red ink, "Get out while you can." "Comforting," Mike murmured, adjusting his waterproof camera. Emily checked her watch, 5:23 p.m. The sun was already starting to set, painting the stormy sky in shades of sickly purple. Blackwood Mansion stood atop the hill like a grotesque shadow against the skyline, 3 stories of Victorian architecture in an advanced state of disrepair. "The coordinates match," Laura commented, checking her tablet. 7 unexplained deaths, 4 disappearances, and dozens of reports of paranormal activity in the last 100 years. Jay finally broke his silence. "My grandmother used to say that walls had eyes. That at night, you could hear voices calling from the shadows." As they walked towards the mansion, carrying their equipment through the rain, none of them noticed that their footprints in the mud began to disappear as soon as they were made, as if the earth itself was swallowing them. The main door was locked, but Emily quickly located the key that she had borrowed from the municipal archives. The creaking of the hinge echoed through the entrance hall like a groan of pain. The air inside the mansion was thick, filled with an acrid odor of decay and something else, a metallic smell that made their stomachs turn. Mike turned on his camera, capturing the moment they entered what had once been a symbol of opulence and power. "Something's wrong," Laura whispered, her eyes roaming the walls covered in peeling wallpaper. "The air is moving the wrong way." Then they heard it, a whisper so low it could have been imagination. But when everyone turned to the source of the sound, they saw something that made their hearts freeze, words slowly appearing in the dust covering an antique mirror. "Welcome to dinner." Mike immediately trained his camera on the mirror, but the words had already disappeared, leaving only trails in the dust that looked like elongated fingers. The electronic equipment began to show interference, the image flickering like old static. "That's impossible," Laura muttered, pulling an EMF meter out of her bag. The device began beeping frantically, its lights flashing in an erratic pattern. "The energy levels are off the scale." Emily took out old blueprints of the mansion from her backpack, obtained from the municipal archives. "We need to be methodical," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "The mansion has 3 main floors, an attic and a basement. We'll start with the first floor." Jay remained motionless, his pale face fixed on a specific point on the main staircase. "She was here," he whispered. "My grandmother, she always said the stairs were the beginning. That's where she saw them for the first time." "See what?" Mike asked, his camera focused on the musician. Before Jay could respond, a sound echoed through the halls, piano notes, distant and dissonant, coming from the music room on the 2nd floor. The group looked at each other, knowing that it was impossible for the piano to be played. The mansion had been abandoned for decades. "Should we go up?" Laura asked, her EMF meter still beeping wildly. Emily consulted her papers. The music hall was where they found the body of the last owner, Alexander Blackwood, in 1963. Apparently he had locked himself inside for 3 days, playing the same song over and over until a deafening bang interrupted his speech. All the doors on the 1st floor slammed simultaneously, with enough force to make the ancient dust dance in the air. The sound reverberated through the mansion like a primal roar. "That wasn't the wind," Mike muttered, his camera picking up bright orbs that were beginning to form in the air around them. Laura pulled out a small thermal camera. The images that appeared on the screen made his blood run cold, dozens of human-shaped heat spots, moving across the walls as if trapped within them. Jay opened his violin case with shaking hands. My grandmother said music could calm them down, that it was the only thing that kept them in control. The first notes of the violin cut through the heavy air, an old melody, a lullaby her grandmother used to play. For a moment, the mansion seemed to sigh, the shadows receding slightly. Emily took the moment to consult her research journal. Here, there are reports that the Blackwood family performed experiments at their private parties. Something about opening doors and inviting visitors. A sharp scream cut through the air, coming from the upper floor. Jay's violin stopped abruptly, the A string breaking with a crack that sounded like laughter. We need to go upstairs, Emily decided, her professional curiosity fighting her survival instinct. The answers are up there. As they climbed the staircase, none of them noticed that their reflections in the dusty mirror were not following them. Instead, other figures, distorted and ancient, watched them with hungry smiles. The group instinctively backed away, their backs pressed against the corridor wall. The figure of Alexander Blackwood advanced, each step accompanied by a crunch of bones and rotting wood. The music reached an unbearable crescendo, making the very air vibrate. The basement. Emily screamed over the deafening noise. All clues point there. That's where it all started. They ran desperately through the mansion, stumbling down the stairs. Behind them, the music pursued them, now accompanied by a chorus of screams and wails. The walls seemed to contort, faces in agony appearing and disappearing into the wood. Mike continued filming frantically, his camera picking up things the naked eye couldn't see, shadows with teeth, hands emerging from the ground, trying to grab his ankles. They reached the entrance hall, but the front door was gone, replaced by a solid wall. There, Laura pointed to a door almost hidden under the staircase. It should lead to the basement. Jay hesitated, his face a mask of terror. My grandmother, she said we should never go down. That's where they waited. We have no choice, Emily replied, already pushing open the door. It gave way with a groan, revealing a staircase leading down into the darkness. They descended the unsteady steps, the air growing thicker and colder with each step. The basement was a cavernous space, lit only by their lanterns. Stacks of old boxes and sheet-covered furniture created grotesque shadows on the stone walls. In the center of the basement, a circle of black stones was carved into the floor. Strange symbols, which appeared to move when observed directly, surrounded the formation. It's a portal, Laura whispered, her EMF meter going completely crazy. Alexander wasn't crazy. He actually found a way to open a passage. Emily quickly began photographing and documenting everything, her scientific mind struggling to process what she was seeing. The Blackwoods weren't just an eccentric rich family. They were a cult, dedicated to opening this thing. Mike, who was filming the circle, let out a muffled scream. Look at this, he called, showing the viewfinder of his camera. In infrared, the circle of stones glowed brightly, pulsing like a giant heart. Jay approached slowly, his eyes fixed on something beyond the circle. Is that a piano? Indeed, partially hidden by the shadows was a large grand piano. Its black surface glowed unnaturally, as if it were covered in a thin layer of something slimy. Don't touch anything, Emily warned, but it was too late. Jay, as if hypnotized, had already approached the instrument. His fingers lightly touched the keys, and the world seemed to freeze for an instant. The silence that followed was absolute, as if all sound had been sucked out of the universe. Then the piano started to play by itself. The melody was the same as they had heard before, but now with a crystal clear and terrifying clarity. The basement walls began to distort, revealing an infinite space beyond them, a pulsating void populated by shapes the human mind could not comprehend. The circle of stones lit up, and from its center emerged a figure that made everyone recoil in horror. It was Eleanor Blackwood, or what was left of her, a half-woman, half-shadow creature, her eyes glowing with an alien light. "Welcome," she spoke, her voice a cacophony of whispers. "We've been waiting for you. The orchestra is finally complete." The air in the basement became electrified, charged with an ancient, evil energy. Eleanor Blackwood floated above the circle of stones, her form wavering between solid and ethereal. Behind her, the pulsing void beyond the walls seemed to expand, threatening to swallow everything. "For decades, we waited," Eleanor continued, her voice reverberating unnaturally. "Alexander opened the portal, but the sacrifice was incomplete. We needed more of you." Emily, overcoming her initial shock, stepped forward. "What do you mean by incomplete sacrifice?" A terrible smile formed on Eleanor's distorted face. "Music, my dear. The perfect frequency to keep the portal open. Alexander discovered it, but couldn't sustain it himself. So, he brought me, and everyone else." The shadows around them took shape, revealing dozens of spectral figures, the lost souls of Blackwood Manor, trapped in an eternal limbo of music and pain. Laura, her scientific training fighting the horror before her, tried to rationalize, sound frequencies manipulating reality. "It's impossible." "Impossible?" Eleanor laughed, the sound echoing sickly. "You humans understand so little about the strings that hold your universe together. We play them like a cosmic instrument." Mike continued filming, his camera capturing things that defied comprehension, dimensions overlapping, realities merging in the vortex created by the portal. Jay, still close to the piano, felt his fingers move involuntarily over the keys. "I can't stop," he moaned, the music flowing through him like an electric current. Emily realized with growing horror what was happening. "They're making us part of the orchestra," she shouted. "We need to close the portal." But how to close something that defied the laws of physics? The answer came from an unexpected source. "Dissonance," Laura suddenly exclaimed. "If harmony keeps the portal open, then..." Without hesitation, Emily ran to the piano, her hands joining Jay's on the keys. Instead of following the hypnotic melody, she began playing random notes, creating a cacophony that made the basement walls shake. Eleanor screamed, her form beginning to distort. "Stop! You don't know what you're doing." Mike, understanding the plan, began shouting into his camera's microphone, adding noise to the discord. Laura joined in, her voice rising in a primal scream. The portal began to pulse erratically, the intermingling realities now clashing violently. The trapped souls seemed to awaken from a trance, their forms momentarily solidifying. "We can't leave them here," Jay shouted, recognizing his grandmother's face among the specters. Emily, still playing frantically, had a desperate idea. "The crystal," she shouted at Laura. "Use the crystal we brought." Laura understood immediately. Taking out the small quartz crystal they had brought as part of their paranormal equipment, she hurled it with all her might at the center of the circle of stones. The impact was cataclysmic. A wave of energy exploded from the collision point, sweeping through the basement. Eleanor Blackwood was the first to be hit, her form disintegrating into thousands of particles of light. The trapped souls, freed from the portal's control, began to rise, their faces expressing relief and gratitude as they disappeared. The vortex beyond the walls began to close in, realities violently separating. The group clung to each other, feeling as if they were going to be torn apart by the force of the implosion. And then, silence. When they finally dared to open their eyes, they were back in the normal basement, dusty, dark, but decidedly part of their own reality. "Is it over?" Mike asked hesitantly, his camera still on capturing their shocked faces. Before anyone could respond, one last whisper echoed through the air, barely audible. "Thanks." In the days that followed, as they tried to process what they had experienced, they discovered that the Blackwood mansion was completely gone. Where it once stood, there was now just an empty field, as if the building had never existed. Mike's recordings, although distorted and fragmented, provided enough evidence for Emily to publish an article that shook the paranormal community. Laura dedicated herself to studying the psychological effects of sound frequencies, seeking to understand the limits between science and the inexplicable. Jay, deeply affected by the experience, composed a symphony that, according to critics, seemed to touch the very soul of the listener. But on silent nights, when the wind blew through the trees, they could all still hear, ever so faintly, the echo of distant music, a reminder of the thin veil that separates our reality from the unknown, and of the dangers of seeking knowledge beyond understanding. Human. The man without a face. The autumn sun barely penetrated the dense foliage of the trees when Ethan Parker's Jeep pulled up to the entrance to Whispering Pines State Park. The digital clock on the dashboard showed 15:37, and the sky was already starting to take on orange tones, foreshadowing dusk. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" asked Samantha, Sam Rodriguez, adjusting the strap of her gear backpack. As a freelance photographer specializing in paranormal phenomena, she was used to strange places, but something about Whispering Pines made her particularly uneasy. "I've never been so sure," Ethan replied, checking his audio recorder one last time. The investigative journalist had spent the last few months researching the mysterious disappearances that had plagued the region for decades. 17 people have disappeared here in the last 30 years. All under the same circumstances. From the back seat, Dr. Marcus Way, renowned forensic psychiatrist, cleared his throat. 19, actually, he corrected, his dark eyes shining with a mix of fascination and apprehension behind his thin-rimmed glasses. "I found 2 more cases in the county files last night." The fourth member of the group, Olivia Blackwood, a descendant of the region's first settlers, remained strangely silent. His pale fingers caressed an ancient silver medallion, and his gaze seemed lost among the trees. "There's something wrong here," Olivia finally murmured, her voice shaking slightly. "Something very old, and very hungry." Ethan ignored the shiver that ran up his spine. After years of covering bizarre cases for his investigative journalism blog, he had learned to trust his gut, and his gut was screaming that there was something different about this case. The disappearances followed a very specific pattern, always at dusk, always alone, and always without a trace. The group began walking along the main trail, Sam methodically photographing each landmark and fork. Marcus consulted an old map, comparing it with notes on his tablet. The air grew heavier with each step, filled with a sweet, putrid odor that none of them could identify. After about an hour of walking, they arrived at a clearing that was not on any official maps. In the center, an altar-like stone structure stood, covered in symbols that Marcus immediately began photographing and documenting. "This isn't Native American," he muttered, running his fingers over the inscriptions. "In fact, it doesn't look like anything I've ever seen before." Olivia staggered suddenly, bracing herself against a nearby tree. His face had lost all color, and his eyes were wide with terror. "He's here," he whispered. "The faceless man. He knows we came." Before anyone could question the meaning of those words, a sound echoed through the forest, not a howl or a scream, but an absolute, unnatural silence, as if all sound had been sucked from the world. The sun had completely disappeared now, plunging the forest into deep shadow. Ethan turned on his flashlight, but the light seemed to be swallowed by the unnatural darkness that surrounded them. The air was suddenly freezing, and their breaths formed little clouds of steam. "We need to set up camp," Ethan decided, trying to keep his voice steady. "Now." As they set up their tents with shaking hands, neither of them mentioned the shadows that seemed to move in the periphery of their vision, or the growing feeling of being watched by something their eyes refused to fully process. Night fell over Whispering Pines like a suffocating blanket. The 2 tents, set up next to the stone altar, looked too fragile against the darkness that surrounded them. Ethan and Marcus occupied one of them, while Sam and Olivia settled in the other. The silence of the forest was oppressive, broken only by the occasional snap of distant branches. "The symbols are pre-Columbian," Marcus murmured, analyzing the photos on his tablet. But there's something off about them. As if they've been distorted by something beyond our understanding. Ethan turned on his audio recorder, hoping to capture some sound anomaly. The wind whispered through the trees, bringing with it fragments of sounds that made their hearts race, shuffling footsteps, the occasional muffled sigh, and something that sounded awfully like the distant cry of a child. Around 3 in the morning, Olivia sat up abruptly in her sleeping bag. "He's getting closer," he whispered, his glassy eyes fixed on the tent entrance. At the same moment, the temperature plummeted. The air inside the shacks condensed into a dense fog, and an acrid smell permeated the room, something between ozone and decomposing flesh. Sam, who was standing near the entrance to his tent, was the first to see it, a tall, slender figure standing at the edge of the clearing, its silhouette only slightly darker than the surrounding night. "Ethan," she called, her voice shaking. "You need to see this." But Ethan was already outside his tent, camera in hand. The figure remained motionless, as if observing the camp. Even from a distance, you could tell that something was terribly wrong with his proportions, arms that were too long, fingers that seemed to have extra joints. Marcus began reciting something in Latin, a prayer, perhaps, as he frantically consulted his notes on similar cases of apparitions. It was then that the creature turned around. Where there should have been a face, there was only a smooth, pale surface, like melted wax. There were no eyes, no nose, no mouth, just that terrible absence of features that somehow seemed to be staring right at them. "It's him," Olivia whispered, grabbing Sam's arm hard enough to leave bruises. "The man without a face. He came to take us, like he took everyone else." The stone altar began to vibrate, emitting a low hum that made his teeth hurt. The carved symbols glowed with a sickly blue light, pulsing like exposed veins. "We need to get out of here," Marcus shouted, but his feet felt glued to the ground. An invisible force held them still as the faceless figure approached with slow, deliberate steps. Ethan, still holding his camera tightly, began recording frantically. "The creature is approaching. It appears to be about 7 feet tall. Its skin, if we can call it skin, appears to be moving, as if there is something writhing beneath it." A new sound cut through the night, something between a whisper and a scream, so sharp it made the very air shake. The surrounding trees bent as if struck by a gale, and the darkness between them seemed to gain substance, condensing into shapes that his eyes refused to fully process. Sam managed to raise his camera just in time to capture the moment other figures emerged from the forest, all faceless, all moving in unnatural synchronicity towards the group. "They're the missing people," Marcus shouted, his body shaking violently. Somehow, they were transformed. Ethan realized, with dawning horror, that the altar wasn't just an ancient structure, it was the epicenter of something much darker. And they had just awakened whatever had been dormant in those forests for centuries. Panic set in among the group as the faceless figures approached in an increasingly tighter circle. Ethan desperately tried to get his camera to work, but the electronic equipment seemed to have completely died. "The symbols!" Marcus suddenly shouted, his wide eyes fixed on the altar. "They're not just inscriptions, they're a kind of barrier." Without thinking twice, Sam picked up a sharp stone from the ground and began furiously scratching the symbols on the altar. The effect was immediate. A sharp sound, like shattering glass on a cosmic scale, reverberated across the clearing. The faceless creatures stopped abruptly, their smooth heads turning in unison towards the damaged altar. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. "Run!" Olivia shouted, breaking the trance. The group didn't hesitate, plunging into the darkness of the forest. They ran blindly through the trees, branches lashing their faces and roots threatening to trip them with every step. Behind them, they could hear the sound of something moving quickly through the vegetation, something that didn't care about physical obstacles. "Over there." Ethan pointed to a dark structure ahead. It was an old cabin, its rotting boards barely standing. With no other option, the group rushed inside. The inside of the cabin was covered in dust and cobwebs. Broken furniture and long-abandoned personal belongings created a desolate scene. But what really caught their attention were the walls. Every inch was covered in frantic drawings, symbols and writing. "My God," Marcus whispered, his flashlight illuminating the inscriptions. "This is a diary, from someone who has encountered the creatures before." Olivia approached one of the walls, her fingers lightly tracing the symbols. "These are the same as the altar, but different. Like someone was trying to reverse them." Sam began frantically photographing the walls, his professional instinct momentarily overcoming his fear. "Look at the dates," she pointed out. "These records are decades old. Whoever did this was trapped here for a long time." Ethan found a dusty diary on a broken table. His hands shook as he leafed through the yellowed pages. "Day 237, they keep coming. They have no face, but somehow I know they're watching me. The altar is the key. The symbols keep them trapped, but they also feed them. It's a vicious cycle of eternal horror. Day 301, I discovered something terrible. The creatures aren't invaders, they're us. All of us. Whatever's behind it turns people into empty vessels. But for what? Gia, I think I understand. It's a bridge. They're building a bridge between our world and something beyond. Each transformed person is a brick in that cosmic bridge. And when it's complete..." The sound of shuffling footsteps outside interrupted Ethan's reading. The creatures had found them. "There has to be a way out," Sam muttered desperately, looking for a window or trap door. It was then that Olivia noticed something strange on the floor, a circle of symbols, similar to the one on the altar, but inverted. I think it's protection," she said, her voice shaking. With no other option, the group huddled inside the circle. Outside, they could hear the cabin's boards being torn away. The first faceless creature entered, its body contorting impossibly to fit through the opening. Others followed, filling the small space of the cabin. But something strange happened. The creatures stopped at the edge of the circle, unable to cross it. Their bodies moved erratically, as if they were trapped in a time loop. "It worked," Marcus whispered, disbelief in his voice. "But for how long?" As if answering his question, a deafening sound shook the cabin, the sound of reality being ripped apart. In the center of the group of creatures, the air began to distort, opening into a dark rift that pulsed with an unnatural light. And from within that crack, something began to emerge. Time seemed to distort inside the cabin as the pulsating rift grew, swallowing the light and warping reality itself around it. The faceless creatures stepped aside, forming a reverent semicircle in front of the opening. From the dark vortex, a figure that defied human understanding emerged. It was as if someone had tried to create a human being based only on a vague description, resulting in something going terribly wrong. His limbs bent at impossible angles, and his head was a kaleidoscope of ever-changing faces, each expressing a different, terrifying emotion. "It's the architect," Olivia whispered, her face pale with recognition. "The entity my ancestors tried to banish centuries ago." The being, the architect, turned its many-faceted head toward the group, and they felt the weight of countless gazes boring into their souls. When he spoke, his voice was a cacophony of whispers and shouts. "You came. As I knew you would. As they all do, in the end." Marcus, visibly shaking, took a step forward. What do you want from us?" The architect made a sound that might have been laughter, if laughter could cause physical pain. "Want? I want nothing. I am the want. The void between the worlds that yearns to be filled." Ethan, still holding his unused recorder like a talisman, found the courage to speak. "The disappearances, the transformations, why?" "Form follows function," the architect replied, their faces contorting into expressions of ecstasy and agony. "Your bodies are imperfect, limited. I perfect you. I remove the superfluous. The face is just a mask. Without it, you are pure. Ready. Ready for what? Sam asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The architect extended one of his impossible limbs, touching the air as if it were a solid surface. Wherever it touched, reality rippled. To be the bridge. The path between what is and what can be. A universe of infinite possibilities, free from the constraints of form and reason. It was then that Olivia stepped forward, her silver locket shining with a light of its own. My ancestors imprisoned you once. We can do it again. The multifaceted being seemed to expand, filling the entire space of the cabin. Your ancestors were fools who played with forces beyond their understanding. They did not imprison me. They invited me. And now, the invitation is complete. With a gesture, the protective circle on the ground crumbled like sand in the wind. The faceless creatures advanced, their fluid forms blending into one another, creating a sea of pale, pliable flesh. It was in this moment of seemingly total despair that Ethan had an epiphany. Remembering the notes in the hut, the symbols on the altar, he understood. It's not a bridge, he shouted to his companions. It's a mirror. All of it, the symbols, the transformations, it's a distorted reflection of our reality. Marcus got the idea immediately. Of course. That's why the inverted symbols protected us. We're not fighting something external, we're fighting a corrupted version of ourselves. The architect emitted a roar that caused the very fabric of reality to shake. Fools! Your understanding changes nothing. The process has already begun. This world will be remade in my image. But Olivia, with sudden clarity, understood what needed to be done. Tearing off her locket, she held it up before the architect. If it's a reflection you want, then it's a reflection you'll get. The locket, a family heirloom passed down through generations, began to glow with blinding intensity. Its reflection, multiplied infinitely by the architect's countless eyes and surfaces, created a kaleidoscope of light that filled the entire cabin. The multifaceted being screamed, a sound that contained the horror of 1,000 dying worlds. His body began to fold in on itself, sucked into the vortex he had created. Quick! Olivia shouted to the others. Think about who you really are. What makes us human? As the chaos of reflected light and distorted reality enveloped them, each of the four clung to the deepest memories of their humanity, Ethan, to his tireless search for truth, Sam, to the beauty he captured through his lenses, Marcus, for the compassion he felt for each patient he treated, and Olivia, to the weight of the history and responsibility she carried. The vortex expanded, swallowing the faceless creatures, the architect, and finally the entire cabin. For a moment that seemed eternal, the four friends found themselves suspended in a void of pure possibility, where reality was as malleable as clay. And then, with a deafening crash, everything collapsed. The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan, Sam, Marcus, and Olivia found themselves lying in the clearing where it all began, the stone altar now reduced to rubble. The sky above them slowly lightened, announcing dawn. Slowly, painfully, they sat up, looking at each other with a mixture of relief and disbelief. They were alive, whole, and most importantly, they were still themselves. Is it over? Sam asked hesitantly, his voice hoarse. Marcus ran his hands over his face, as if to make sure his features were still there. I guess so, he replied, not entirely convinced. Ethan was the first to get up, staggering to his backpack, which miraculously was still where they had left it. His recorder, previously inert, now blinked, indicating that it had captured something. With shaking hands, he pressed play. What followed was a cacophony of sounds, screams, whispers, the architect's roar, all mixed into a chaotic symphony. But underneath it all, almost imperceptibly, there was a melody. An old song, sung in a language none of them recognized, but somehow felt familiar. The song of my ancestors, Olivia murmured, her eyes filling with tears. They never really abandoned us. As the sun fully rose, bathing the clearing in golden light, they began to notice subtle changes around them. The trees seemed more alive, their leaves a more vibrant green. The air was clean, free of the putrid smell that had tormented them. "Look," Sam exclaimed, pointing to the place where the altar used to be. In place of the rubble, a small sprout now grew, its leaves glowing with an ethereal light. All around him, in a perfect circle, wildflowers of every color had bloomed. Marcus approached cautiously, examining the phenomenon. "It's as if the earth is healing." Ethan, still holding his recorder, felt a sudden understanding. "It wasn't just a fight against an otherworldly being," he said slowly. "It was a confrontation with the darkest parts of ourselves, with the fears and emptiness we all carry." Olivia nodded, her locket, now a simple piece of silver with no otherworldly shine, weighing heavily in her hand. The architect, the faceless creatures, were physical manifestations of the void we tried to fill, of the masks we wore. "And by facing them," Sam added, "by holding on to what makes us truly human. We heal not just this place, but a part of ourselves," Marcus concluded. Slowly, they collected their belongings, each object seeming strangely mundane after the experience they had lived through. As they walked back to the main trail, each of them felt a profound change. Ethan knew that the story he had to tell would challenge everything he believed he knew about journalism and reality. Sam saw the world through his lens with a new appreciation for the beauty and fragility of existence. Marcus felt that his understanding of the human mind had expanded to encompass realities that science could not yet explain. And Olivia, carrying the weight of generations, has found new strength and purpose in her legacy. When they reached the edge of the forest, they stopped for a moment, looking back. For an instant, it seemed as if they could see silhouettes among the trees, faceless figures, but no longer threatening. They were reminders, echoes of a battle fought not only in that forest, but within every human being. "What do we tell people?" Sam asked, breaking the silence. Ethan smiled, a tired but genuine smile. "The truth. Or at least, the part of it the world is ready to hear." As they walked toward the jeep, leaving whispering pines behind, each of them knew that their lives would never be the same. They had looked into the abyss and, instead of being consumed by it, they had found an inner light they didn't even know they had. The faceless man was no longer an external threat, but a reminder of the constant journey of self-discovery and acceptance we all face. And as the sun rose in the sky, promising a new day, the four friends knew they were ready to face whatever darkness the future might bring. For they had learned that true courage lies not in not being afraid, but in facing that fear and discovering that, in the end, our greatest power lies in our shared humanity.